Good afternoon. Let's kick things off. We're thrilled to be here. I'm Will.
And I'm Dave. I'm sorry, I'm getting the hang of this thing.
We are Bully Boy Distillers. It's a real thrill for us to be here this afternoon and kind of share with you some of the trials and tribulations of opening up a craft brand in a very competitive marketplace here in Boston. You want to kick off the slides?
Yes.
I think I might have gotten ahead of myself. All right. So we are probably none of those things that we mentioned. We are Boston's first craft distillery, make rum, vodka, and whiskey. And I think we're not the experts, you guys are, but hopefully you can glean a couple nuggets of truth from our experiences. Just a quick snapshot of kind of where we are today. We opened up 3 years ago. We've been able to grow the company roughly 50% year over year, expanded to maybe 600 bars, restaurants, and liquor stores across Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Rhode Island. Just a bit about where we're from. Dave and I grew up on a small fourth-generation working farm in Sherburne, Massachusetts, about 45 minutes due west of here. And I think growing up on the farm, it was very much part of our DNA, this notion of sort of making your own thing. It wasn't called craft. It was just something we did for fun. And the earliest examples I can think of were us making apple cider in the fall. And we had a little 5-gallon cider press, and then it was very innocent as kids. And then sort of adolescent curiosity led us to discover that, hey, hard cider's kind of a new thing too. And we sort of began to understand the merits of that. And eventually we graduated to a little 2-gallon stovetop still that we made what would loosely be described as sort of an Applejack or an apple brandy. Probably giving a little too much credit. But we also, I think, were impressed at a young age with the challenges of operating a farm in Massachusetts. It's really, let's face it, it's a dying industry. And I think from a young age, we were really intent on trying to create additional sources of income for the farm. Eventually, of course, this took the embodiment of a distillery. But we felt that we could most successfully launch a brand in the city of Boston.
So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the decision to locate the distillery in Boston in a bit, but I wanted to touch on the difference between starting a craft brand and a brand that's a mass-produced consumer product, because they really are different things. I don't think it's news to anyone here that in this sort of digital age, there are a lot of people that feel disconnected. And what Will and I have found is there's this real nostalgia for products that are real and authentic and have a story behind them. You look at the farm-to-table movement happening in the restaurant space. You look at the number of college graduates that are going into organic farming. You walk up and down a grocery store aisle. You can see the origin of each one of those products, where they come from. So there's this real movement towards authentic products. And in a lot of ways, that sort of inverts the traditional consumer products paradigm. Historically, it's been all about the product. The product has been kind of paramount, and the person behind the product is really secondary. And with the craft movement, it's all about the people making the product, and the product itself, I don't want to say is an afterthought, but they're sort of equal parts of the equation. They're interwoven. And so that's been a really important thing for us to realize. And the trick is sort of connecting the dots. So figuring out how the manufacturer connects with the consumer. And one of the things that Will and I realized pretty early on is that you need a compelling story. It's a compelling story that sells the product and gets the consumer to sort of know the producer. And if it's true, even better. We were lucky enough that our story lent itself to a liquor brand without a whole lot of fabrication.
So what is that story? It's put concisely. We're two brothers who grew up on a fourth-generation working farm, making award-winning spirits here in Boston. And what that sort of simple phrase gives us is the three pillars of any sort of entertaining story. people, place, and plot. And the degree to which we can support each one of those, I think, really will help determine the long-term success of the brand. So let's take a look at the first component, which is place, Boston. Why Boston? I think for starters, Boston has a long history. Specifically, it's got a long history, long involvement with spirits, dating back to George Washington, the colonial era, and firing up the troops with a daily ration of rum, through more modern times, and the beloved Old Mr. Boston, which was actually in Roxbury, a couple blocks from Bully Boy. So I think by inserting Bully Boy into sort of this longer narrative, it helps give us a little more legitimacy. Especially in the craft world, there's a natural sort of skepticism, I think, towards the sort of new kid on the block. And so sort of making ourselves a part of the Boston story has really helped strengthen the brand, I think. The second thing which we really liked about Boston, I think has been a huge asset for the brand, has been the very strong regional identity that's here. And it's an important point because there's so many cities that are sort of faceless in this country, and Boston really has a unique, strong identity that we feel is something we can really leverage as we grow Bully Boy.
Yeah, so a little bit more on that. You think of made in the USA. That's always kind of been the storyline. And in the craft world, there's this emerging regionality. So certain cities around the country are starting to develop their own personalities. Brooklyn, New York is kind of like hip and edgy. You got Seattle and Portland on the West Coast. They're kind of like the meccas of craft. San Francisco, wholesome, healthy, athletic. Boston also has its own personality. So when we think of Boston, we think of sort of loyal, honest, educated, innovative. And most importantly for Will and I in our branding, Boston has a really unique sense of humor. It's this kind of like cynical, sardonic sense of humor that you don't find in other parts of the country. It's really an East Coast thing. And we like to refer to that personality as our lovable, wise-ass friend from high school. And so we try and use that voice, harness that voice, and infuse it into all the marketing materials that we do for our brand. So these are two posters that we sell out of the distillery. They were done by our friends at Digitas. Again, you get that kind of like familiar voice, very low key. It doesn't reek of marketing. These are two Valentine's Day posts. Two Facebook posts we did surrounding Valentine's Day. We do a lot of this kind of like micro advertising on Facebook where we'll come up with funny subject matter. But the idea here, the idea with all of our stuff is kind of creating this connection between the person making the product and the person buying the product in the store.
All right, so let's take a look at the sort of second component to any sort of compelling, successful story, and that's the people. And really, obviously with Bully Boy, that's Dave and I. And I think what we're effectively doing is just serving as a counterbalance to sort of the faceless global brands that in more recent time, I think consumers have felt burned by, be it through unfair labor practices, or maybe they're using some kind ingredients that aren't healthy. The one thing the craft movement has done so well, I think, has been to create a sense of accountability in the eyes of the consumer. They feel that, I think when you're in a store looking at something that is in the craft section, you feel as if the person behind the product kind of has your back, and that there's a real humanity to what meant the manufacturing of that good. And at a bare minimum, Dave and I need to accomplish that if we're going to succeed. And I think what we've tried to do is take it one step further and introduce the idea of the family business. And the brother component for us, I think, adds an extra layer of sort of warm and fuzzy familiarity. And we've been really impressed, I think, with the additional buying power that gets us. I think at the end of the day, when someone's in a liquor store and looking at a whiskey from Tennessee or a vodka from Europe, they're going to want to support the two brothers that, are just average guys making great stuff. And so we've got a lot of mileage out of the whole brother thing.
The plot. The plot for us is the farm. Anyone who starts a small business, especially a small liquor business, is going to get the why question. Why the hell did you get involved in this? It's risky. It takes a lot of work. We're away from our families a lot of the time. And so you have to have a compelling answer to that question. And for us, the farm is what really gives things context. There are so many people that are trying to get into the micro distilling space right now. It's a really trendy thing to do. And what Will and I have found is a lot of the people entering the market are doing it almost as a result of sort of like entrepreneurial whimsy. They've reached a point in their life where they're unhappy with what they're doing. They want to find something new, and distilling seems kind of sexy and fun. We wanted to avoid being put in that basket because we really come to distilling much more organically. For us, the decision to start a distillery really grew out of our childhood. And that's where the farm comes into play. There are really two storylines surrounding the farm. And the first one is the vault. And actually, you can see in this slide, that's a picture of the vault. It's an actual vault in the basement of the farmhouse. And it houses all this old Prohibition and pre-Prohibition era liquor. So brands like Medford rum, cow whiskey, very old vodka. These really authentic brands that existed obviously a long time ago. And so there's a real association with spirits and the distillery. So there's a connection between the farm and what we're doing in Boston. The other storyline that Will and I have made use of is the one that he alluded to earlier, which is small farming in Massachusetts. It's a dying way of life. We grew up seeing this firsthand. It's a really tough way to make a living. And so we wanted to find a way to support farming. We wanted to find a supplemental stream of income for the farm. And so long term, our goal is to source all our grains from Charles Cote Farm, where we grew up. So all those two storylines, they provide real authenticity to our brand, and they make it seem much less random.
All right, finally, any good story needs a plot twist. For us, it's been the so-called mom effect, and Dave and I are continuously astounded by the uptick in web traffic whenever we put a picture of our mother on Facebook. I don't think neither of us can really figure it out, but I suspect that it's probably further underscores this sort of warm and fuzzy familiarity that the whole family business aspect brings in. And I think people subconsciously are saying to themselves, if this 70-year-old lady is willing to go into a cold, dark distillery and slap labels on bottles all afternoon, that these two guys can't be that bad. And so if you're consulting on a craft brand or thinking of starting one, definitely try to weave a mom into the storyline. So another thing that we learned early on is it really pays to have a story that's multidimensional. There are always going to be parts of your story that resonate with certain audiences and don't resonate with others. And for Will and I, it's really been the brothers thing locally. That's what most of the local rags have gravitated towards. There's a Herald and a Boston Globe article here. Nationally, it's really been the Made in Boston thing. We were lucky enough to appear in some national publications, and what they gravitate towards is the fact that we're two guys making distilled spirits within the city limits, and we're the first ones to do it in Boston in a really long time. And that's an important point, because when we start to grow out of our local market and we no longer get the benefit of being the local guys, we have to have a storyline that sort of resonates nationally and hopefully globally. Will and I like to say that local is your best friend or your worst enemy. It's great if you're local. It's great for us in Massachusetts and Rhode Island and New Hampshire, which are really sort of backyard markets for us. It starts to become a barrier to entry and an impediment when you enter markets where you're no longer the local guys. So when we start to sell in New York, there are 10 local distilleries that we've got to compete with, and they're always going to get the benefit of the local audience. Boston is a great way
to infiltrate those markets. It's a brand that's respected nationally, even globally. And you know, if we were making whiskey in Fort Myers, Florida, I think it would be a tough sell in Brooklyn, New York. But Boston is a brand that you can really leverage up. So just to synopsize, what have we learned here? Probably not all that much. But, craft. Craft has really inverted this sort of like traditional product paradigm. It's now all about the person as opposed to the product. And you got to flesh that person out. And the way that you do that is with a really compelling storyline. And every story's got to have plot, it's got to have people, and it's got to have a place.
We talked a little bit about the changing paradigm from a national to a more regional level, and the potential pitfalls or benefits of that depending on what region you're located in. And finally, our extreme optimism and confidence in Boston as being one of those regions that can serve not as an impediment, but as a springboard as we grow Bully Boy, sort of nationally and then hopefully globally at some point.
So we're going to try and sneak this video in here. I see we're running out of time, but
Dave, real quick, I forgot to mention.
Well, sorry, bro.
The first six people that tweet, we're going to give a bottle out to the first 6 people that tweet at Bully Boy Booze, hashtag Brandon in Boston. Sorry.
So yeah, this video touches on a lot of the themes that we discussed. We do a lot of this behind-the-scenes content. We found that the consumer is really hungry to see the people making the product, actually making it with their 2 hands. So we've got a number of these videos that have really resonated with our audience.
Dave and I use a blackstrap molasses as the basis for our rum. It gives it a wonderful confectionery quality, almost a butterscotch vanilla, and historically was what was used to make rums in this region. At one point, Massachusetts had close to 60 distilleries, all making rum in this style. For each 200 bottles we make, we produce about 150 gallons of spent molasses wash, or close to 2,000 pounds. So the obvious question is, what do you do with this? On the one hand, you can dispose of it, but to our way of thinking, there's no sense in disposing of something for which there is an agricultural use.
Blackstrap molasses is actually only 45% sugar. The remaining 55% is vegetable matter. So there's a lot of magnesium, iron, copper, and calcium, which are all great things for a growing cow. Will and I have made the choice to take our spent molasses wash and transport it out to the farm that we grew up on. Charles Coate Farm is a 4th generation working farm, and our family's been farming that land for a little over 100 years. Will and I grew up working on the farm, and it was actually our introduction to the idea of craft. There were about 100 apple trees on the property, and we grew up making cider. And then from there, that progressed to hard cider and eventually to apple brandy. But the farm is really where all of this got started.
The liquor business can be a pretty hectic world, and it's really nice to get back out to the farm and be reminded of why we got into this business in the first place. I'm Will.
And I'm Dave, and we are Bully Boy Distillers.
All right. Thanks very much.
Thanks, guys.